So welcome everyone to Funding Texas Nonprofits, how foundations are supporting nonprofits in our changing environment. I see in the room with us some of our friends that join us for a lot of our webinars and also some new people. For those of you that I haven't met, I'm Dr. Angela Seaworth, and I've been with the center and teaching at A&M now for almost 4 years as a teacher. And we have some of my other colleagues on here as well who will be sort of monitoring our chat as we facilitate our discussion about foundation funding today. So to let you know, one of the things that in my title, which is a little strange for some people, because it's Director of Philanthropic Initiatives and Capacity Building. We had a long discussion about what that would mean and choosing those words and working with foundations and understanding how they interact to support the nonprofit ecosystem, how they support nonprofits. That would fall under the philanthropic initiatives part of it, but also some of the work they do actually helps build capacity. So I see today as a really nice opportunity to look into that portfolio of our work. And we're delighted because we have some wonderful panelists for you. So if you haven't been with us before, let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll be able to talk just a little bit about what our center is doing. Get our slideshow started. Can someone confirm for me that yes, you're seeing the PowerPoint slide? Great, thank you. Looks like MJ, so I appreciate that. So our center was actually established in 2017, so we're relatively young in this work, but all of the centers are actually fairly new, as our field's only been in the academy for about 25 years. But what our center likes to do is focus on promoting a vibrant nonprofit and philanthropic sector. And so certainly in Texas and now beyond, as we have Aggies living everywhere and we're working and collaborating with people around the country. But we do that by producing research, having professional outreach, and also engaged learning. And that's across all. We try and translate those across everything that we do. We certainly believe that nonprofits are going to create opportunity for everyone. And we think about it in 3 very specific areas. One, we know that capable leadership, excellent governance, and engaging our stakeholders are 3 ways that we can really help nonprofits thrive. So our work revolves around that, and of course is absolutely committed to all the principles of the Bush School that you would know and expect from our Bush School. So our educational opportunities, if you're not aware, are expanding. We have a master's degree, but we have also the executive master's program where you can complete the master's degree completely online. We also have a graduate certificate in nonprofit management. So if you aren't quite ready for the master's, there's the step in between. That's an online program, but we've also expanded into continuing and professional education courses. So if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us. We're doing that. And then this portfolio of the work that I'm sort of introducing to us today about philanthropic initiatives and capacity building, that's something that we're really turning our attention to this year. And we hope that we'll be able to share more of that with you, because that's the work that we think is going to be some thought leadership about how we all work together across the state, and also providing direct services to nonprofits. So why are we talking about foundations? And the reason is because they play such a unique role in the nonprofit space. I've tossed a definition up here for some of you who may be joining us that aren't really sure what a foundation is or does. There are certainly different types of foundations. Today, we're talking with private foundations about what they do. And you see that the Council on Foundation defines that as, an organization that's supporting charitable activities by making grants to unrelated organizations. They're not funding their own work necessarily. Their work and mission is to fund other institutions, and that could be through research or education. It could be across the subsector. But one thing, and particularly studying the history of foundations, which I've done, my background's in philanthropic studies. So we spend a lot of time in history and understanding how foundations have helped shape our society and have helped engage us in all sorts of community activity and also movements over time. And what we found is that I think that could be the most interesting elements is the unique role of foundations. Because they have a responsibility with the funding that they have, whether that comes from a family or a conversion. Actually, we have one of our panelists today is with a conversion foundation, regardless of what, like, sort of the origination of the wealth and funds that the foundation is stewarding at this point. They have the responsibility for developing a mission that's going to serve the public good. And what a nice opportunity to be able to do that. If it's family foundation, there are certainly maybe some more narrow scopes and preferences. But when you're looking at the notion of what a foundation does, they truly exist to try and improve the quality of life for all of us. And what strategy do they develop in order to do that? So strategies are a really important part of what they're doing and how they can invest their corpus for us. Another thing is foundations over time have enjoyed this really, I think, fun role of being able to experiment. They're the foundations are the ones that can take a chance on a really interesting idea or a charismatic leader that can really help grow an organization. And they can allow us to test new ideas on how we can try and make our world better. And then once we see whether or not it's working and we can make adjustments, they're the ones that have that experimental and sort of exploration role. And when it's working, then it can be scaled up by government or other private philanthropy. And I think that's one of the fun things that we've done. A lot of that happened in the 1920s when we had this sort of the golden era of foundations and the creation of them. Really, the general public and community were actually quite afraid of this vehicle. Like, what is this foundation? Will they be able, with tremendous wealth, be able to force us to act, behave, change our behaviors in any way? They're really leery of what foundations can do. Now, in hindsight, 100 years later, we see that some of the benefits of the initial risks that foundations took, we all benefit from them today. So with that, I wanted to show you a little bit of data on how foundations have been giving over the last few years, because they have indeed increased giving, particularly over the last 5. So this is data from Giving USA. That study has actually been done since 1965. So we've been studying where dollars have in philanthropic giving, where it's been going, who's been giving that for quite some time now. And we just look over the last 5 years and see growth. On the left, you'll see the total dollars that foundations are giving in billions. And we see reactions to that as far as our reaction in 2021. These are Giving USA numbers, by the way. So the giving in 2021 here is actually the dollars given in 2020. So remember, the Giving USA reports take about 6 months to compile, and that's why it's always analyzing the giving from the year prior. So if you want to go in, I've dropped in the link. If you can go on the Giving USA site and explore some of this yourself. So we see a reaction there. Actually, it's an increase up to 19% of giving. Prior to this, sort of in the early 2000s, foundation giving was hovering around 13 to 15%. So we've definitely seen, an increase in giving, and we're up to a point now where it's almost $90 billion a year. So with that as sort of a foundation for why we're talking about with foundations today and how they can support our nonprofit ecosystem, I'd love to introduce our panelists. We have Joe Cresitos, the Vice President for Grants, the Episcopal Health Foundation. Charles Glover is with the Meadows Foundation as Vice President of Grants, and Tessa Pennington comes to us from the Greater Texas Foundation, and she's the project associate it's right here for you, programs and strategy team. So she and her team spend a lot of time thinking about strategy as well. I would love to go ahead and allow our panelists to share a little bit about their foundations and what they would like to about their bios. I do know, wanted to point out that Joe is currently the board chair for Philanthropy Southwest. So that is an organization that actually allows foundations to gather and really convene some of the strategy and thinking around what's happening with philanthropy in 7 states, I believe. And I'll let Joe take it from here.
Thank you, Angela. So I'm the Vice President of Grants for the Episcopal Health Foundation, which is a health conversion foundation here in Houston. And we serve the 57 counties of the Episcopal Diocese because as a philanthropy, we're actually organized as a public charity and supporting organization of the Episcopal Diocese. And so our territory is large. We fund only in health because, again, of how the organization was started. Philanthropy Southwest is a philanthropy serving organization. It's representing foundations of all sizes and types in 7 states throughout the Southwest. We have an annual conference in October of each year. And we also do professional learning to really inform the field of philanthropy in terms of best and next practices. And so if you are representing a philanthropy, I strongly encourage you to join as a member of Philanthropy Southwest. And if not, certainly be able to work with the foundations that are part of the association. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And we do, since I'm going to mention the other, some academic affiliations for other panelists, I will mention that Joe has studied with the LBJ school because we don't want to leave her out because we do have some Aggies on the other side of the screen. So Charles, could you give us a quick introduction to the Meadows Foundation and you?
You bet. Howdy, I hope everybody's doing well. I'm an Aggie as my undergraduate work and a big fan of the Bush School and the work that's happening there at Texas A&M. Also a big fan of LBJ. So I'm the Vice President of Grants for the Meadows Foundation. I've actually been in this particular role for less than a year and previously served as a senior program officer for a little over 7 years and oversaw our education portfolio. The Meadows Foundation itself is a private family foundation. So as Joe shared with you, they're a conversion foundation, conversion from a healthcare system sale, and a foundation was created out of that. The Meadows Foundation was originally founded by Al Meadows, and the family's business and the assets that poured into this foundation came from the energy sector. The foundation has existed technically for more than 60 years. Has really been operating in its current state with our what we would call professional staff over the last 35 to 40 years. And so we give across 6 different program areas. We have 5 specific initiatives within those program areas. And then we have some fields of high interest, and then we maintain the ability to react. So a portion of our giving is reactive giving. So if you kind of think about a funnel going from strategy to reactivity or reaction, we have certain things where we're investing in systemic or long-term approaches, and we have certain things where it's being brought across the line to us or our staff, and we're reacting to it in that way. So some things we're proactively driving, some things we're reacting to. To that end, we're the largest private family foundation that has Texas as its statewide territory. So we cover every county from Pampa to the Valley to Houston to up to North Texas. I mean, if you were in Texas, we exist to serve the state of Texas and the people of Texas. In particular, our initiatives right now are centered around post-secondary completion in the education space and educator preparation. Our initiatives in environment are centered around water conservation. Our initiative in health is centered around depression, specifically inside of mental health. And then in human services around homelessness, particularly in the Dallas and Collin County areas. But we do fund across the spectrum. So again, when we talk about initiatives that we have versus program areas, our program areas cover everything. And we approach different elements of our work in different ways with what we're trying to support and fund. And we may talk a little bit about that further today. But the foundations had the unique ability to and privilege to partner with individuals like Joe and the Episcopal Health on initiatives like the Texas Equitable Vaccine Uptake Fund, and with Tessa and the Greater Texas Foundation for initiatives, particularly around the post-secondary space. And so we're just one of many partners and players that engage in this work. And we have a very, very broad portfolio. And then we have some very specific targets within that portfolio.
Thank you so much, Charles. I'm really glad that you noted the partnerships, because sometimes when we're on the nonprofit side of it, right, and we hear here's $1 billion or a multi-billion-dollar foundation, it feels like, well, can't they take care of everything in our county? The reality is foundations don't, no foundation in America has the resources they really would like to have to solve some of these problems. They're dealing with some of our most complex problems. And the more complex the problem, the more people we need thinking about it, and the more likely we are to need partners in order to solve that. But I wanted to remind that all of our nonprofit participants online that foundations can't be our only solution. And especially if they haven't engaged with foundations a lot. Tessa, how about you? Can you share a little bit about the Greater Texas Foundation and your work?
Sure. So I am Tessa Pennington, and I am a Bush School graduate, recent Bush School graduate. I graduated in 2020, and then I started working with Greater Texas Foundation in July of that year. So everything that Greater Texas Foundation does is focused on helping more Texas students to obtain post-secondary credentials. And I will just note, we were founded in the 80s as the Greater East Texas Higher Education Authority. I had to look that up to remember the full name accurately. And we were a nonprofit student loan servicer. In 2001, the board split up that organization into a public charity, which is Greater Texas Foundation, and then the loan servicing arm, they kept that, and then in 2005 sold that and used that as an endowment to endow Greater Texas Foundation. So that's where our endowment comes from. Our strategic plan, we just started in 2020 before the pandemic in January, and we have 5 primary pillars that I won't go through in much detail, but we're focused on helping all Texas students from all backgrounds, with a particular focus on students who have been traditionally underserved and underrepresented in higher education. And so we are a statewide funder. We have modest resources, and so we really look for opportunities to invest in system-wide changes. And so that's where a lot of our work is, and we partner with all kinds of organizations, but our most common partners are public universities and community colleges, but we do also have partnerships with nonprofits across the state as well.
Thank you so much. Well, what I've charged our panelists to do is to think about 3 specific questions. And today, what we're going to do is I'm going to keep the slides down so you can actually see our participants and as we talk together. But the first question we'd like to talk about, none of us can escape, is the pandemic and COVID. So I'd love for you to share, what are your foundation's fundraising strategies at this point in COVID? So if all of us remember, initially when this happened, their foundations had an immediate reaction to try and help stabilize, but then they sort of, stage 2 was sort of stepping back to think about, strategically, how can we address this? So now that we're a year later than the strategic point, what are you thinking about with COVID? And also, have any of the strategies or procedures that you adopted to deal with the pandemic, have you learned that they're so effective that you might be keeping those around as part of your standard operating? So I'd love to start with Tessa on this one.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, when the pandemic hit, we were 3 months into our new strategic plan. So our board, had had a discussion, should we change our strategy? Should we adopt a new strategy or revise it in some way to adjust to COVID? And what they decided to do was to move forward with our strategic plan, understanding that we're operating in a COVID context. So we did see changes in the kinds of requests that we were getting. Just from a programmatic standpoint, I mean, we started an emergency aid program for students to access emergency aid at small community colleges across the state, and a lot of other issues related to student basic needs and immediate support for students. That was new for GTF to have that level of investment in those kinds of initiatives. But I think more pertinent to this conversation, as far as the grant making process itself, we did take a little bit of a step back to allow our grantee partners space to make adjustments to their work. Many of our grantees had in their grant proposals, they had all these big plans for in-person student gatherings and things like that, that obviously could not happen. So we, and especially our grants management team, worked very, very closely with the grantees to make adjustments as needed so that the programs and the spirit of the programs could be carried out or postponed. We offered some no-cost extensions to give a little bit more time for organizations to be executing their plans. And I think something that made this successful is just really good two-way communication. Our grantee partners were wonderful, letting us know what they needed and where they were at. And our grants management team was very responsive, and just that relationship building with the grantees was something that was really important for being successful in the things that we set out to do during the pandemic. So that's something that we're hoping to continue and to carry forward. And hopefully we don't have another big pandemic or world crisis that we have to respond to, but we hope that this will help us be more nimble in the future as things come up.
Thank you so much. Charles, what's your perspective on how Meadows is handling COVID at this point?
Yeah, you bet. I mean, a couple of things. I think it's more about, early on, when the move went towards what kind of flexibility can we create for our partners. When you look at reporting and when you look at some requirements, or if there were any grant restrictions on anything, we really moved to ensure we established immediate communication with those partners, and then worked around that as would have been a case-by-case exemption, but we really proactively put that out there and said, look, if you need to move money to emergency operating, if you need to move resources here, assets here, let us know. We can work with you on that. We can delay reports. We can, so we moved to do a number of things to essentially create flexibility for our partners who were hardest hit in that moment and the populations that they serve. I think that's one. I think two is, it's a balance between, there are different philosophies on this of kind of wait and see and then provide backfill. So it's like, when these emergency things are occurring, we're not actually trying to fund that immediate component, but we're letting our large nonprofit players and partners know, hey, as roll this out and we'll come in behind and we'll backfill resources for you, versus putting in some proactive strategies in place to actually fund in real time. And so there's a combination of both of those things. And in the beginning, it really became about us reacting as much as we possibly could. We were having meetings almost daily as a staff to try to bring this information forward and in a way that we could react to it. In addition, we moved to remove a lot of barriers in application for our grants. We expedited a lot of our digitization and a lot of our components that we had been talking about or thinking about or pushing slowly along, and we went warp speed with that, and that was the right thing to do from an access standpoint. And then lastly, or not lastly, but when you're looking at the reactions, and to Tessa's point, this is an unprecedented crisis. We had little information. Everyone was in real-time learning mode. So were we. And then looking at, okay, from our strategic initiatives, how are those being impacted? And what kind of framework of support do we need to be providing those for the long-term impact as we see COVID? And so that was sort of the first 6 to 12 months. We executed the highest number of emergency grants since I've been on staff at the Meadows Foundation. And it became probably 50% of our total giving in the year 2020. Is probably close to 35% of our total giving in 2021. And now we're really focused on, and Joe may speak to the vaccine uptake fund. So I don't want to go too far down that road because it's really something that Episcopal drove. But we got on board early in trying to ensure that practices, public health practices, are coming to the forefront in how Texas is responding to this. So now that we've got some data over here, how are we not just reacting, but how are we proactively getting things out, like, messaging around vaccine uptake, messaging around the safety and precautionary measures that can be taken, things of this nature. And then, where we are now is this is an impact, I think, as everybody knows on the call, that this never ending, really, right? It's just a matter of what type of impact. Is it acute? Are we in a maintenance phase? But it can't be underestimated, particularly when we look at the mental health, child welfare, and education spaces. They just absolutely, from the child welfare standpoint, and early childhood care providers have been decimated as a part of this process. You have a drop in incidence reporting on child abuse, but that's a lot of times because that first reporting happens in schools. So you actually have higher rates of most likely real child abuse, lower levels of surveillance and reporting. And that's a huge component. And most of you probably heard about the foster care system issues that are occurring right now. That's been exacerbated by this. And then we look at education, we see an 11% drop in post-secondary enrollment. We actually see a 5% drop in high school enrollment. So, students are making decisions to take low-wage jobs as opposed to continue their high school education. And we've made significant progress against high school education completion goals over the last 20 years. And we haven't seen a drop like this in the high schools in a long time. And so those are the kind of things that we want to be cognizant of and think about from a strategic standpoint. How are we plugging those gaps alongside our partners, and frankly, driven by our provider partners, and then alongside our funding partners as well.
Thank you so much. Joe, what's your perspective?
Sure. So, our perspective at Episcopal Health has always been about building the capacity of an organization. And we've been even hypersensitive about doing that which we believe that can be sustainable for the long haul. As it related to the pandemic, which is a different type of disaster, as it were, as compared to natural disasters, which we seem to have our fair share of here at Houston. So looking at it more broadly, some of the systemic things that we did were, as Charles referred to, was to work with other philanthropies to put together a fund relative to vaccine and the messaging that was getting out with an eye toward communities that we knew were either reticent or had some aspect of not being fully informed with scientific data. That infrastructure still exists. So if there's ever another issue of this magnitude, then the structure is in place for philanthropy to be able to pool their resources again and act very quickly, because in situations like this, the ability to get money out quickly is of utmost importance. And philanthropy is really the first dollars in, because their money tends to be the most flexible. So that's one thing that was done at a more systemic level. We also created a loan fund with an eye. Those funds are directed really towards.
I just got an email that you didn't get approved, or that mine didn't get approved.
On those things.
I was like, yeah, I email it.
Could we mute our guest? Thank you.
Okay, I'm
Sorry about that, Joe.
Yeah. we created a loan fund. As a health philanthropy, we fund a lot of community clinics. And because those clinics are largely federally funded, what we were doing, we're tracking two things. We were tracking with our clinics in terms of what is it that they need, what they were seeing in the population of patients that they were serving. And we were also tracking with what was happening at a federal level with money that was coming down into the clinics, because what we didn't want to do was supplant money. And so it was conversations with these clinics and our other grantees, which are a number of mental health providers, assistance ministries, organizations such as that, to quickly figure out what it is that they were experiencing and what they needed to have funding for. So the loan fund was an additional opportunity for clinics to be able to have funding that they could use, that they were not for expenses that were not being covered otherwise. At that same time, we also funded them specifically for COVID-related expenses. So for us, what was different is that we funded childcare services for clinic staff, for example. We funded mental health services for clinic staff, in addition to the work that the clinic needed. So a lot of clinics needed to either expand their IT platforms just because of virtual patient visits. A lot of organizations like assistance ministries that really all of their work was face-to-face. We had to quickly figure out how to support them in identifying and employing IT systems, purchasing IT systems so that they could transition their work from a face-to-face, a largely face-to-face type of interaction to one that was virtual. We continue to support those programs because, again, what we believe is that, you know, you can have almost too much money or not enough money, but we want to make sure that the money that we're putting in there is something that we're going to be able to sustain and that operationally the organization is going to be able to handle for as long a period of time as can be feasible.
Thank you very much. We appreciate all the extra thought and work that your teams have done to try and help during this unprecedented time. Now I'd like to move to another very complex issue, but the question is only one part. And we'd like to talk a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion. For those of us people on the call who don't know, 3 of the primary faculty members here at the center, we've all done research on diversity in different ways: diversity in nonprofits, diversity in governance, and we've been doing this for more than 10 years. So it's something we care deeply about, and we actually just rolled out a certificate in social justice. So that shows our commitment, I think, to this. And we're wondering how foundations, how you've been thinking about it, but specifically if you've adopted any new practices with your grant applications or your reporting requirements to address social justice and DEI work. So Joe, would you like to start with that perhaps?
Sure. So one thing that we are aware of in the pandemic is the disproportionate impact of that disease on certain populations. We, again, as a health philanthropy, have been funding work that we call the social determinants of health, which are all the non-medical issues that impact an individual or families and communities as to why they are experiencing adverse health outcomes. So as far as looking at this as an issue through a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it has been a part of our intent as a philanthropy all along. I just think that the pandemic exacerbated and heightened the sensitivity to how certain populations were being impacted by this. That said, however, what we started doing was really getting deep into our own journey about what that really means as a funder. And we started to do 2 types of work. That work which was internally based as a staff, and that work which is externally facing for grantees and communities that we support. Because what we realized is that we can't do the external work unless internally we had done that work. And so we created structures for our staffs, equity circles, equity affinity groups, whereby we could begin to understand exactly what this means. What does racial justice and health equity mean for EHF as a foundation, as well as what are the lived experiences and individual understandings and appreciation, or not, quite frankly, of the members that constitute our organization. And so we've worked with external consultants in helping to guide us through some of that work. And we continue to embed those practices and do that work and continue our own learning journeys so that we can begin to have authentic conversations amongst ourselves that will embed and build our capacity to have those conversations external to the foundation. We are as a staff, a very diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, religious affiliation, sexual orientation in the organization. And so I think that we're very fortunate in that way to have people with lived experiences representing those backgrounds to help inform this work. I will say that as we were undertaking this more deliberately, we reached out to see what other philanthropies were doing. And so if we talked to 10 philanthropies, we got 10 different opinions. So what we learned is that this work is really individual and endemic to a philanthropy. And it has to be, because every philanthropy has a different staff. Every philanthropy has a different mission and service area and communities that they serve. And so that work really does need to be specific to them and sensitive to them. And so we're very much on a learning journey. I don't think that we have a magic bullet. We're happy to share what we've learned and what we're doing. But what we understand is that it's not a marathon. It's work that has to be part of the culture of our organization, and that it's ongoing. There's not an end game to this. Although what we hope ultimately will result in is better health outcomes for the communities that we fund in, as well as a better understanding of our staff and working with those communities to address racial justice and health equity.
Thank you so much. Charles, what are you doing that might be different than how they've approached it? Because I did expect to get 3 pretty different answers because of what Joe just described.
Well, I do think there's a lot of common threads in the approach to this that Joe laid out, which are, internal reflection is a huge component of this before you apply it to your external practices. I would say there's a few things that I would highlight just as functional practices here from our vantage point, just so that I'm not, repeating some of the same things that I think Joe laid out, which are incredibly important. And that is, in our hiring practices, we've been very intentional about the kind of pools that we're building, candidate pools that we're building, and ensuring that we are identifying candidates who would otherwise not have what we might consider common or historical access to a lot of the networks or conversations that we would be driving otherwise. And that's an important part of the internal culture building component and what you're actually reflecting as a staff and as an organization in the work that you do from a diversity of multitude of perspectives. I think the second thing is, and I'm getting really functional here, but one of the things that we're going to be rolling out is a dual language website moving forward, because the second most spoken language in the state of Texas is Spanish. We have a number of grantees that are in primarily Spanish speaking areas of the state, or Spanish as a first language. And so those kind of things are functional components that we can be doing. In addition, this year, we're going to be rolling out proactive informational sessions for Black and Indigenous and people of color-led organizations. We do not do proactive informational sessions as an organization. It's not something that we've done in the past. And so we'll be doing that, but in a very targeted way for organizations that have traditionally either not been in our applicant pool or felt that they did not have access to what is actually a very radically inclusive process. So we're one of the few foundations that has a completely open enrolling application. So anybody can apply at any time in this, as long as you're serving the state of Texas as your service demographic. So a lot of people find that out and they're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. I thought you had to know someone. I thought you had to know. I thought, and no, you don't. But we also need to make sure we're communicating that, right? And so that creates a lot of workflow on our staff side, but it also gives us a lot of different viewpoints that we otherwise wouldn't have. In addition, what we call the lens of equity, it goes across all of our work. So if you look at our program areas, if you look at our initiatives, our fields of interest, whether it's animal welfare as a field of interest, or whether it's water conservation as an initiative, or whether it's the environment as a program area, what lens of equity are we putting on that? And so we're collecting the data, for instance, on the board representation of the organizations we serve and the executive leadership staff of the organizations that are in our grantee portfolio and the service demographics of who are in our grantee portfolio. So we actually have an abundant, robust amount of data collected from a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion on each component of the organizations that are in our grantee portfolios. The question is, how are we leveraging that data? What are we learning from it? How does that drive our actual work? I think the first step, to Joe's point, you'd have to put one foot in front of the other. And the first step of that is ensuring that we're collecting it. And we've now made that actually a part of our update to our board moving forward. So our board actually receives that data in aggregate now on a continuous basis. And we compare particularly the service demographics of our grants against the demographic makeup of the state of Texas. So where are we over-serving? Where are we under-serving? So on and so forth. And then lastly, it's kind of going back to not just in the pool creations for hiring, but our existing staff. Are we creating an environment where everyone can bring their true, authentic, and best self to work? And when we do that as an environment, it also translates into how we're engaging with our grantees. We have one of the most diverse, vibrant states in the United States. I'd posit the most, but that'd be very Texan of me. And it's an honor and a privilege to serve it. But we also need to ensure that our practices are adjusting for that diversity and that vibrant state.
Thank you so much. Tessa, do you have some information to share on what you're doing?
Yeah, so like Joe and Charles, equity is a core value that Greater Texas Foundation has, and it's something that we hope goes across all of our grant portfolios, regardless of what issue area it is. We specifically call out low-income students and students of color in our strategy as a particular population of focus. And we recently adopted a new reporting practice, and grantees now can report the demographics of students they're serving, so that we can ensure that our investments are actually touching the populations that we're hoping that we're serving. And to Charles's point earlier, when he mentioned the enrollment decline for post-secondary education at about 11%, it's closer to 20% for Black male students. And so we're really trying to be intentional about supporting that group in particular, and making sure we have, culturally responsive pedagogy. We have programs that promote senses of belonging on campuses for those students, so that they don't fall out of post-secondary education. Something else that I'll highlight that Charles also mentioned, geographic diversity is an area that we've really tried to be intentional in our grant making, and we've carved out a section of our grant making just to support rural collaborations. 85% of the state of Texas is rural, but they do not receive 85% of philanthropic funding. So part of our goal in intentionally calling out rural collaborations is we want to make sure that there's equitable grant making for Texans across the state, not just in well-resourced areas or areas that are close to urban centers. So that's a little bit of what we're doing for trying to be more aware of equity and diversity in our portfolio.
Thanks to all of you for sharing, how you're approaching this. And I appreciate the notion of the rural urban challenges that we face. That is something that we're working on a little bit right now. So our third question really comes from the fact that we look at the nonprofit space, and I kicked us off by saying, we're relatively new as a field of study. Right? We've been in the academy for about 30 years, and that's a generous count. But it's really been in the last couple of years, we've had some seismic shifts in how nonprofits are operating, with what nonprofits are having to do to provide services within the pandemic, the challenges they have there, the workplace dynamics that have come from that as well. We anticipate that making it much harder to recruit and retain talented people to run our nonprofits throughout the state. We used to be able to allow people flexibility, but now all of a sudden, with everyone working virtually, corporations are going to allow that. It takes away one of our key things besides, do you believe in our mission? Are you passionate? And we can also let you have flexibility. We've lost that. Also working with more attention to DEI. These are complex things that our nonprofits haven't faced until now. So in addition to the traditional capacity building of, do we have, CFOs, executive directors, development officers, program staff that can do their jobs well and have the basic training they need to do their jobs, there's this additional layer of complexity that is going to challenge capacity building. So what I'd really love to know now is, what your foundation's doing to support capacity building and how you're thinking about that. So nonprofits around Texas can have a pipeline of qualified and talented individuals leading the organizations in our communities, because they're so important. We are the nonprofit space. We are the social fabric of communities. So how can we assure that they're strong? Charles, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, you bet. Capacity building in a very specific way for our foundation has played out in one of two functions. So we planted around the state of Texas over 30 years ago, or around 30 years ago, started a plant called the Centers for Nonprofit Management. So we have one in Dallas now. They're in other communities like Laredo. They're a part of a community foundation. And that's specifically designed to provide multi-level and multi-layered and multi-industry based nonprofits with capacity building opportunities. It looks different in different communities. And that's work that has played out differently in those different communities as far as the actual roles those entities ended up taking on and how effective they were and they were for that nonprofit space. So we've made some very large investments in that space over time. Some of the more recent investments in that space have been with entities like Catch a Fire, for instance. If any one of you all are familiar with Catch a Fire, which is an entity that I think we're finding is most helpful for smaller organizations that are lacking some core capacity functions around development or communications and things of that nature, and then providing that resource for free for our grantees. And we want to expand that even beyond our grantees as we look at utilizing something like Catch a Fire. We've also looked at other things that are working on building communities of learning for nonprofit executives. So again, these are all very different approaches, but they all fall into the realm of capacity building because you see burnout and turnover and a lot of the things that we would see in any industry that's passion driven is oftentimes overlooked when we think about the nonprofit space. And then lastly, I would say the category is individual organizational capacity building. So we receive grant requests where organizations are saying, okay, for us, we need to do X, Y, Z from a capacity standpoint. And that could be, again, incredibly functional, like a development staff, all the way to, a pedagogy around learning and continuous improvement. One of the things we're wary of is individual FTE funding without a sustainable path to knowing how that could stay there, because when something is fully grant-based, when that grant goes away, or if that grant were to go away, then the first thing that goes away is that practice or whatever was being funded. And so we do consider that when we're looking at these organizational, piece by piece basis, or a piece by piece basis. So, we really, it's the gamut. And you mentioned like nonprofits are kind of dealing with some of these things. They were already working with a lot. Now they're dealing with a lot of these other components. I would say nonprofits have been, to an extent, dealing with all these things all along. It just hasn't been as recognized as a component of the work. And from a funding standpoint, it's sometimes hard to get people focused on capacity because they want to do the things they can see, touch, feel, things of this nature. And so I think couching those things and how it drives that work is really critical for nonprofits, because I think that gets them more buy-in for some of those things that less people understand are a really big part of them being able to execute the work well.
No, thank you. And I'm so pleased to hear you say the community learning, the 2 capacity models that we're testing at the center right now have to do with that sustainable learning and community. And in my 20 years of doing it, I've come to know that if you don't have the one thing is, if you don't have the support around you, you can't continue the practice. So I'm excited to hear that. We have about 4 minutes left. Joe, Tessa, would you like to weigh on how you're handling this or approaching it?
Yeah, I will just quickly add that we actually have a whole area of what we call organizational effectiveness. And the purpose of that is to really help build strong nonprofit organizations so that they can maintain their operations over the long haul. So we've done a lot of funding in areas related to strategic planning, assessments, leadership development, coaching, fundraising, and sustainability. And that's really looking at the use of capital within these organizations and ways and opportunities to be able to leverage that. We also fund them for their own equity learning and training and consultancy for those organizations as well. The second thing that we do is what we call business continuity. It was started by one of our staff members, Bridget Samuel, who I think is on this call. So shout out to you, we're still doing it. But it's really looking at succession planning within our nonprofit grantees with 2 things. It's not just at the leadership level with the CEO, for example, but we're also looking at the programmatic level. So if you have a program manager that has worked in your organization for a number of years and leaves for whatever reason, what is the organization's plan to really continue with that work, to have someone on tap that can assume that person's responsibilities so that the work continues to occur. It's actually been one of the more popular things that we've done. In every cohort, we always have a waiting list of grantees to participate in it.
Thank you. I know I've helped with an organizational assessment when Bridget was there, and it's actually an organization that was struggling and turned out to be one of the strongest and most vibrant and helpful organizations in their community during COVID, after they had 2 to 3 years to actually act on the recommendations from that assessment. I know you're doing good work there. Tessa, if you don't mind, I know you said you guys are just beginning to think about it. Would it be okay if we open up to questions from our group? Because we do promise that we keep around 5 to keep us to under an hour. Are there any questions that you have for our panelists? I see one in the chat about asking if Charles would speak about the Power Foundations collaborating with each other and pooling their support for initiatives, like the Texas Rural Funders have.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jennifer. And Connected Nation is obviously a critical partner in the Meadows Foundation, and one of our program officers, Mike McCoy, works primarily with them. And that came through work from the Texas Rural Funders Collaborative, which is there actually is a set of pooled funds, but it actually started more as a learning collaborative among organizations. And we see that in a lot more than just the rural funding space. So we were mentioning Philanthropy Advocates a little bit right before this call, which is a galvanized set of funders in the education space. There are environmental working groups inside of Philanthropy Southwest, for instance, which Joe chairs Philanthropy Southwest, that bring, you know, a lot of foundations together. And so I see more of it happen from a learning perspective, but there's a lot of pool funding as well. The Texas Equitable Vaccine Uptake Fund would be another great example of quickly bringing pool funding together from multiple entities around the state. And when you have a foundation landscape that tends to be highly regional, meaning a lot of the foundations support their specific region or a specific region, like Houston Endowment has 4 counties, TLL Temple has a set. As Joe mentioned, they cover 54 counties. Those are the kind of things that I think these collaboratives are so important on, because it allows people who may have a regional only focus to engage in a larger, broader response or an answer or infrastructure building for something that will serve not only their region, but this entire state as well. And so the Texas Rural Funders Collaborative is a great example of that. And we've seen many others as well over the years. And I think that the pooled funding part of it is going to continue to grow. I can tell you right now, we're in a couple of conversations right now about getting in new and national dollars. And we need those pooled funding components set up in order to engage in those conversations.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? Or as we're waiting for those to come up, I would like to note that our next webinar, we're going to do one again next month. It's March 17th, same time at noon. And Dr. Kenny Taylor is going to be talking about assessing and building equity at nonprofit organizations. So that's something to look out for moving forward. We have another question. To what extent are you looking for metrics from grantees pursuing nebulous change and or change that can't be isolated? Are you more interested in proxy measures or documented stories from service recipients? And I'll let you guys decide who would address that.
I this one. So, you know, the thing about metrics is that, particularly if you're doing work that's experimental or it's a pilot or you're trying to demonstrate something, it may not be always obvious what those metrics are. And so we have metrics that we've developed. It's a whole taxonomy of stuff, but we also encourage the organizations that we fund to really develop their own, because we want to be able to understand from their viewpoint what works, what they're measuring, what they see as efficacious. And so I think, you know, particularly with some of the first in dollars where it's an experiment, those things need to be documented. And I think it's some combination of what's quantitative and qualitative. I don't necessarily think that they're universal measures that can be applied to everyone everywhere, because a lot of these projects and the work is so endemic to a specific population or a community. And so what I would encourage is that what organizations are thinking about, to document that, share it with the philanthropy. And if it's something that they're interested in, the philanthropy being able to use their dollars, maybe for a consultant to come in and help figure out what that is, to have that discussion with that foundation to do that.
Thank you. We have one other one that's a question that says, how long should an organization reasonably wait to see meaningful change from a recommendation report? And our participants actually referring back to the organizational assessment and the work that you do and that Bridget has done that used to manage. And so if your organization funds a strategic plan for someone, an organizational assessment for them, how long are you perhaps willing to give them before you re-engage them, and whether they'll be funded or there need to be further changes made? Is that a fair way of asking?
So what our perspective is with our grantees is that we're actually building something in the organization. So we never fund someone just one time and that's the end of that. And rare are the times that we fund the same organization for discrete projects. And so if it's something that they're planning and we understand what their plan is, if it's over 2 or 3 or however many years that it is, and it's work that makes sense for us to continue to fund, then we're certainly having conversations with that organization along the way. Particularly if we need to continue to provide funding for it, if they're gathering, funding from other organizations, public funding, what have you. So I don't think that our perspective has never been, finish a thing and then stop. It's, work on something that you have the opportunity to leverage and build, and keep identifying those markers along the way, and what makes sense in terms of leveraging funding for that as well.
Any other comments from our panelists to answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies on a case-by-case basis, right? On the size of the organization, the particular component that you're trying to implement. And at the end of the day, it kind of bridges into the metrics component of what will be the desired outcome of this at what period of time. And we look to the provider or the nonprofit to tell us that. And then it's really working from that as a stake versus telling them, this is how long this should take, right? Or this is how, because you're going to have such variance and we want to be in a supportive role versus a directive role, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for your time, for joining us as all of our participants. We had a large room, but we want to thank our panelists for talking about some complex issues that because they're learning as we go too. So we appreciate that. If you have any questions about, how our center can help your organization, or those of you that are here as individuals, and how we can help you along in your career, please feel free to reach out to us. I will go ahead and put that information back up on our screen as we leave. But again, thank you for joining us, and we appreciate the great conversation today.